Hello everyone. Today we're talking about social stratification. Complex societies divide people based on things such as wealth, gender, caste, class. There's numerous ways societies divide themselves up. But here's a look at social stratification in state-level societies, mostly dealing with class and also, because we're talking about the United States, divided by race. These are the questions I give my students. Many of my students are from other places, so I ask them who the underclass is in their society. Here in the United States, we have this baggage that we've inherited from slavery and then from Jim Crow laws, where when we think of an underclass, we tend to think about race. Other countries have different kind of tensions. Is it ethnic groups? Is it immigrants? It can be like South African apartheid based on race. In Brazil, they think of race somewhat differently, so the underclass would be somewhat different. So take a look at these questions. Okay, moving on. Social scientists have debated whether it's prestige or economic factors that are more important in explaining the behavior of people in complex stratified societies. Here we have people protesting factory work conditions in 1913. This is a picture from England. So is it based on economics, or social conflict theory sees life as a competition and focuses on the distribution of resources, power, inequality? This could sound very familiar to you in the message of Karl Marx, and it keeps coming up. What kind of say in one's life should the working class have? And this is a reoccurring theme. It's been happening since the Industrial Revolution and keeps coming up. Karl Marx argued for the primacy of economic and class interest, while Weber, a sociologist of the 19th century, argued for status being more important than economic interest. Here you're seeing an image of elementary school mothers protesting integration in the 1960s. So what Weber was saying is that's how come the Populist Party didn't rise up, because William Jennings Bryan in the 1890s was saying, look, the problems of workers are the same, whether these workers are white or black, they're being oppressed under the business interests. So if blacks and poor whites voted together, they could make their lives better for everyone. However, from Weber's point of view, he knew this was going to fail because the Jim Crow laws said, well, no, look, there's a real caste system here going on. Whites are told that they're better. They belong to this elite privileged group, and by keeping the less privileged group as an underclass, it keeps the status. And people would rather fight for that status than join and admit to being poor and part of the oppressed minority or the oppressed class. I'm not saying Marx or Weber which one was right, because there's elements of both that are very obvious. And it would explain Jim Crow laws in the United States pretty well. So Marx's idea, conflict theory, claims society in a state of perpetual conflict is caused by competition for limited resources. So we see this in the United States, dear heavens, with the political contest going on right now with President Trump's view versus Bernie Sanders' view. You can clearly see this conflict. But we also see it at a world level. the richer countries versus the poorer countries. So conflict theory is both local and global. There's also something called functionalism or structural functionalism, in which these class conflicts are necessary because someone has to be in the worker class, someone has to be in the owner class. And according to this structural functionalism, everyone has a function to play in society, and when people defy their roles with deviant behavior, that deviant behavior needs to be met with sanctions for the greater good. We can't have people leaving their jobs and protesting, otherwise there could be social chaos. So what does this all mean? I'm bringing this all up to talk about, well, race in America, but you could think about it by other differences based on the region of the world one lives in. That we've looked at all kinds of genetic variation as anthropologists, whether groups are lactose tolerant or intolerant, blood typing, skin pigmentation. There is no criteria in which one group fits that other groups don't. Humans have these things, all animals actually have these things called clines, in which there's blending between one group and the next. So we know that race, black and white, Asian, European, it's a folk taxonomy. It's a cultural category. It's stories we tell ourselves to understand our world. So race is a folk taxonomy. So this is a cultural translation of human diversity, and folk taxonomies are powerful and we use them because this is how we categorize our world. We have folk taxonomies for shoe types, and is pink a shade of red or is its own category? Well, it depends on, I guess, if you're an artist or not, whether you place mauve in pink or red. I hope that makes sense to you. Oh, and this image here is actually an anti-slavery image from that era. It's saying how horrific the slave trade was. Okay, all cultures have folk taxonomies for the human variation that they're aware of. So, isolated groups that don't meet other people, so people on small islands or very isolated mountainous regions will tend to have two categories, give or take. There's us and there's them. Nice and simple categorizations. Groups that meet a lot of people will have a lot more cultural categories for people. Okay. Because we tend to categorize people, racism then can be a major problem. So, you guys know the definition of racism: judging an individual by his or her assigned racial affiliations based on assumptions about that group. Prejudice and discriminations are based in these beliefs. So here's a picture from the 1940s in which in America the Japanese were seen as a threat to many Americans. We had a president that said that they needed to be isolated. The Supreme Court said that, sure, this is fine. Of course, now we've realized what an abomination that was. Our country has apologized for it. Small reparations have been made. But this idea that a group of people are all evil, that's the definition of racism. So that's why I'm showing you this terrible picture. So these folk taxonomies have been around for a long time. You guys know who Linnaeus is. He's the guy that came up with the names for animals like Homo sapiens and, you know, the binomial nomenclature that we give all species. He went a little too far though. So this was actually in Harper's Weekly magazine in the 1890s, right when Jim Crow became really solidified in America. Plessy versus Ferguson made segregation legal. This appeared in the magazines. And Linnaeus said, okay, there's 5 subspecies of humans, the Iberians, the Teutonics. So this was what people were believing. This is how they justified this terrible segregation. So these familiar racial categories are a folk taxonomy. White, black, Asian, Hispanic. Yes, people from different regions have different phenotypes, but this isn't a set way to define people, but it's how we justified slavery. It's how we justified destroying whole cultures. So the picture down in the corner here is pretty tragic. The Tasmanian people had been isolated on an island, and because they were isolated and they didn't have very much cultural contact, it really hurt them, because 90% of innovation comes from seeing other groups and adopting their technologies, adopting their tools, adopting their behaviors and food sources. So the Tasmanians had spent thousands of years isolated. They had lost simple technologies. I think the fishing net and the needle had been lost to this group. And their phenotype was quite different than the English explorers that went down there, English conquerors that went down there. And so the English tried to enslave them, and it didn't quite work. So they realized that they wanted this land for themselves and offered a bounty of, I think, £5 a head to bring in the corpses of the Tasmanians that were killed, to get rid of them on this island. So social and economic agendas are clear motivation for such broad statements such as the ones above. The English and the Americans thought that, oh wow, our system, either kings or democracy, is the absolute best culture. We have a mandate, like by God or by goodness of our democracy, to somehow take in these less developed cultures and civilize them. And that's part of how we justified slavery was, oh, we need to Christianize people. We need to show them what it's like to live in the civilized world. And it was just justification for our conquest. This virulence eventually led to Nazi Germany and their eugenics and genocide movements. But this then led to the world rethinking our ideas on race. So hopefully that was the lowest point we're ever going to hit, I hope. But it did make the world see that, okay, the biological concept of race and these categories need to be rethought. So, anthropology originally was a tool of the colonial powers. We've all got those terrible relatives that we would rather not acknowledge on Facebook. Well, our terrible relatives in anthropology were going down to other countries and showing how, or trying to prove that these cultures were less civilized. They were trying to explain this thing called social Darwinism, in which the European civilizations were the most advanced. The groups with chiefs were a little more advanced than those that were just in tribes with an informal leader, and really more advanced than the bands with no leadership. We apologize for this. We know that even though anthropology came from such terrible sources, we've worked to improve since then. In the 19th century, the existence of biological races seemed as obvious as the existence of different cultural systems. These areas of variation were explained as different stages in the evolution from more primitive to more civilized state, with the obvious value judgments that these imply. Okay, so I mentioned biological basis, races within our species do not, absolutely 100% do not exist. And despite our past history, and we apologize for those terrible ancestors of ours, anthropology can now take almost full credit for this contribution that race is a folk taxonomy. We know it's not biologically real. Okay. However, race is real in the fact that it dictates people's life choices. The groups which they're born into dictate what schools you go to, dictate whether you're in the privileged class or the poorer class, whether you will be able to get a job interview, whether you can open bank accounts in certain areas. So where a person's born, into which groups they're born, dictates their life choices. So while biological race is a folk taxonomy, culturally, it's real. And this term is called reification. This translates a complex set of phenomena into a single entity, such as a number, such as IQ testing, such as the SAT test, college entrance exams, the state achievement exams. These poor students without access to tutoring, poor students that don't have adequate nutrition, or families that are stressed about money are not going to score as high on these standardized tests as students who are well fed, aren't exposed to lead paint, can get tutors. So it's real in that it does affect people's life choices. So here is a made-up test. This is your college entrance exam. See how well you do. One of these is based on the region you live in, or it has something to do with whether your family can afford a house versus an apartment, and the other one is class-based. So blank are to cellar as decorations are to attic. Blank is to cellar as decorations are to attic. So your choices are fish, blankets, roots, or cakes. To get this one right, you have to, 1, know what a cellar is, know what an attic is, and have ever stored things in a cellar or know people that have. And the second question here. The Crimson Skull pulled to the lead. What's the likely outcome of this? Harvard wins, Stanford wins, or they tie? Well, if you know anyone that's been to Stanford or Harvard, you're more likely to know what their school colors are. If you're rich, you're more likely to know what a skull is. So in this case, a skull is one of those backwards rowboats. So the answer, if you're wondering, is you store roots in your cellar and you store decorations in your attic. And here, Harvard school colors are crimson. So, did you get into the college? Okay, so race is not just a matter of whether to apply biological concepts, because we know it's not. And we know there's no subspecies, but this idea is used to prejudice and determine a person's place in society. And look at this picture here. We could just change these signs to whatever's going on now, like maybe for the Obergefell case, and this picture could just apply now as it did in the 50s. So our folk taxonomies are powerful and influential. We respond to them without realizing we're doing it. And there are culture's way of ordering the world and not necessarily scientific universals. Okay, this poor woman, Vivian Malone, in this picture, is trying to register for college. George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, is standing in the door to try to prevent her from registering for school. What kind of thinking leads a person to stand in the way of a young lady trying to get a college education. This picture breaks my heart. Okay, so the important points for this: we're all the same. Skin color is an adaptation to light. Peel us and you really can't tell any difference. Okay, don't peel us, it's rude. But you get the point. But these folk taxonomies, while they're not biologically real, they affect our life choices. By expecting differences and reinforcing stereotypes, these expectations can become real, which is reification. Thank you. I hope I've given you a lot to think about.